Hello, my name is Sophie Tversky, and this is The Curious Connector. Today, I'm here with the incredible Dr. Brennan Jacoby, who is the founder of Philosophy of Work. He has a PhD in philosophy, focusing on trust, and he has a knack for getting to the heart of what really matters. He brings together his philosophical insights and furthers and enables people to develop their good ideas. Welcome, Brennan.
Thank you so much, Sophie. It is an absolute pleasure to always speak with you, and it's a real joy to join on Curious Connector.
Thank you. So let's get started with what is philosophy at work?
Yeah, so Philosophy at Work is an organization that works with businesses on how they think and then how that thinking informs what they do. So it goes right back into the very etymology of the word philosophy, which, if we look at the Greek, philo just means love and Sophia is wisdom. And so if philosophers are doing what they're supposed to be doing, then we're supposed to be really pursuing wisdom. And that means working out what's really going on, what's really mattering, how are the assumptions that we bring to our work really informing what we do, interrogating those well, reflecting carefully, so that we can do more meaningful work, so that we're sort of more satisfied and effective, and ultimately doing just better work all around.
Absolutely. And from that, how do you use philosophy to understand the changes and opportunities which are presented to the range of industries you work with?
Yeah, sure. Good question. So, and I might even just back up a little bit more and say because a lot of times, it's not every day that people will come across someone using philosophy in a professional context. And I get a lot of questions around sort of what does that even look like? What are you really talking about here? And so what it often is we'll either have sort of do talks that are saying we want to have a whole group be challenged in the way they're thinking about a certain topic. Or it might be facilitated sessions where, say, a leadership team will be doing strategy around something, and they like the idea of making sure that they're asking the right questions before they invest a lot of resource in a particular direction. So come in and work with them to shape those questions and make sure that they're sort of interrogating effectively. And then lastly, I do a lot of training sessions on the kind of skills that you get when you study philosophy, but also the things that you just need to bring into our busy work life today. And I think this starts to speak a bit to the challenges that you're talking about. But so I'll do sessions on, collaboration, trust, courageous leadership, critical thinking, these sorts of things. But the idea is that we're not going to do our best thinking unless we feel safe and we have that sense of trust. And we're not going to be thinking really well and therefore not working our best unless we are being professionally courageous. And I don't always just mean sort of big, bold actions, but, doing what we think is right in the moment, in those sort of small steps. So it's that kind of work. It's working with people on how they approach and understand problems, and then having that inform what they're doing. And I think the way that makes me think about changes and opportunities going on at the moment is kind of interesting. So, I work with people across different industries, a lot in the legal space, but also media and tech and finance. And across all of these, there's a couple changes that I see coming up. So we're working much more dispersed than co-located. That's particularly true in the last couple months during coronavirus and everything, but there's a trend before that as well. There's our remits are changing, or at least the way that we understand them. So whether we're working in HR, in legal, in strategy, in comms, what I keep hearing from the clients that I'm working with, this has been the case for the last couple of years, is the way that they're understanding the work has shifted. So their remit is no longer just what we might have called sort of the work, but there's a real need for them to create meaning for their colleagues and their clients as well. So whereas maybe before we would have seen a comms professional primarily understanding their work and having their work understood as sort of a loudspeaker, they're putting out the information. Now there's much more of an emphasis that actually their role is to create meaning around a brand, around around internal ways of colleagues understanding what they're doing. And that might have been true for certain parts, certain branches of comms in the past, but now that's just taking over so much more in that whole industry. Same thing in strategy, in HR as well. It's all about saying not just managing people, but how do we help people understand what they're doing? And that's, I think, a change, but it's also a great opportunity because there's space now for us all, not just to sort of do the day job, but to say, what are we actually talking about here? And the way that you interpret what that meaning has a great impact on what you do. And then the other thing I wanted to say about how I think philosophy makes us think about changes and opportunities that are afoot at the moment is there seems to be a lot more complexity and uncertainty. And ancient philosophers in particular would have said, well, there's always change, there's always uncertainty, there's always complexity. But I think these days, whether we're talking about coronavirus or not, there's at least seems to be an increased experience of change. We seem more aware of our uncertainty, and I think that is a change, and that's I wouldn't want to say an opportunity, but it's an interesting situation that we're in, and it's one where I think things like reflection, critical thinking, what we do with information, not just having more information, all these things are really helpful and really part of the creative process. So if we're talking about creativity and connecting people using skills, I think those things are all going to be relevant, and maybe things that we can unpack a bit more in the conversation.
Absolutely. So let's start with, and it seems more than ever that we need philosophy and we need to have discussions and questions, but let's start with how you use philosophy as a lens, as a tool to understand a problem.
Yeah, sure. So two things come to mind, and I've been reading a lot of Stoic philosophy over the last couple months. And so one of the first things that comes to mind, I think, is particularly out of that school of thought. And it's this idea that the way we understand a problem and the way, therefore, the kind of tool that we bring to it is often down to our perception of the situation that we find ourselves in. So if we're saying that creative solutions are responses to problems, and that they find some sort of solution to a problem, that a solution is some sort of good thing that responds to a problem, which is some sort of bad thing. The Stoics would want to say, I think, people like Marcus Aurelius or Seneca and Epictetus would want to say, the facts of the matter exist. When we say it's a problem or a solution, we're now layering on some value statement that actually lives in our heads. It's not just sort of think happy thoughts and things will come about. Just thinking changes things. It's not as light as that, but there's, I think, a deeper insight here to say the tools that we bring to solve a problem creatively are informed by how we understand the problem. And where we need to start is even just an understanding of problems and how we're seeing things. Because if I take a problem as something that is really, scary, bad, difficult, the Stoics would say, you're already off to the wrong foot. Instead, you need to just look at facts of the matter. So let me give you an example. Say that, say that the tech fails on us right now where we're having this conversation. Internet drops and it's really frustrating. I would view that as a problem. I'd say, oh, that's really annoying. There's a bit of suffering going on now for at least both of us. It's a problem. What's our solution? But the Stoics would want to say, no, actually, all that we can say for sure in an objective sense is that the internet has stopped working. The call has dropped. The computer failed, whatever it might be. In a sort of objective fact of the matter kind of way. Mm-hmm. As soon as I say, and that's a problem, I'm now layering on a value statement that says, and that's bad. And the reason I'm saying this is I think if we view problems as this, if we recognize our necessary sort of negative connotations that we're putting on problems, it has implications for how we go about solving them. So if I view something as necessarily bad, rather than just a fact of the matter, then I'm putting myself in a place where I'm much more likely to have a stress response when I'm trying to solve that problem. So say that, the internet fails. I don't just see that as a fact of the matter. If I do see it as a fact of the matter and I say, oh, the call has dropped, what do we do now? I can be proactive to move forward and find a creative solution. If I say, oh, this is a real problem, what are we going to do? This is awful. I'm now suddenly starting to stress out. We know from psychology and physiology that when we're in that sort of stress space, in that stress state, we're not going to be thinking as clearly. We're not going to have as creative solutions. And so I guess the first way that I interpret problems based on that Stoic philosophy is that we should try to tease out what we're layering on a situation, what we're layering on how we understand a problem. So maybe, we've got to hire someone new. We've got to find a solution to how we do business in this new normal now around coronavirus. And that feels really scary. And I don't want to make light of anything too much and say, oh, it's not really a problem. Just talk about the facts of the matter. But what I'm saying is, by teasing out the details and saying, okay, now we're in this new normal. Before we layer on our understanding of it, let's just talk about the details. That's going to put us in a situation where we're much better able to respond. There's one other thing that I think is also helpful. But maybe before I go into that, can I say, how's that sitting with you as an idea of sort of thinking about that Stoic philosophy in here and checking things? Because I don't know, I'm aware that it's a slightly different approach, and
I think that concept of linking emotion and fact in our ways of knowledge is really fascinating, and we often don't think about that detachment process when we're evaluating a situation. And particularly now, like you said, everyone's feelings and facts are valid, but actually taking the time to break them down and understand and compartmentalize the different bits of how we're perceiving a situation.
Yeah, I think it's hugely strategically valuable. Personally, I find it really helpful, and I think this is why there's been such a boom in people buying Stoic books at this time. That's kind of it is helpful to ponder things this way. But going back to your question, the other thing I wanted to say about how we understand problems, and this I think opens up a lot of tools that we can use to find solutions to them as well. And I guess here I'm going to keep using the language of problems, despite what I said around Stoic philosophy, just because it's the language we're using. But I guess what I mean by this is the way that we understand things which are challenging to us and are received by us as not good stuff. But so, and here the work around wicked problems is really helpful, I think. And I think it gives us a lot of insight on how we can find creative solutions as well. And so just to unpack that a little bit, wicked problems are contrasted in the academic literature around wicked problems. There's a distinction between what is wicked and what is a critical problem or a tame problem. So a critical problem is one which is really time sensitive, but which there's not a lot of uncertainty about. So I don't know, my car not starting, or maybe the internet failing on our call that we were talking about before. That's a critical problem because it's time sensitive. We're having this conversation, or the car's not starting. I need to get to work, whatever it might be. But it's critical because it's time sensitive, but it's pretty straightforward about what to do about it. We stop the call, we restart the computers, we go again. Excuse me. With the car, maybe I drop what I'm doing and I get on the bus, or whatever it might be. In contrast to that, tame problems are maybe less time sensitive, and they're the kinds of things that we've experienced before, and you can fix them by bringing in just a procedure. So, we need to hire someone. We know how to do that. We've got a binder that is our process for hiring in our company. We know how to go through that process. We might not know who to hire. There might be some uncertainty around that, but we have a process for doing it. In contrast to both of those, wicked problems are loads of uncertainty, lots of complexity, and they're quite novel. So, I'm calling you from just north of Oxford today in the UK, and the last couple of years here, Brexit has been a great example of a wicked problem. last summer I was down closer to your neck of the woods in Australia, and I was doing some work around the Royal Commission around trust and finance and things. And I think for many of us, that felt like a wicked problem because there was a lot of complexity to it. Right now, everything, the whole world, all of us are going through with coronavirus, has a lot of correlations to wicked problems. Lots of uncertainty, lots of complexity. Maybe not necessarily, it is novel as a strain of virus, but we have had global health crises in the past. There have been, if not even global to this scale, there have been health crises en masse that we can learn from. But still, I think it makes sense to understand it as a wicked problem. And so I guess the reason I'm bringing up wicked problems is because there's an academic named Keith Grint who's now at Oxford. He was at Warwick Business School when he did this work originally, but he gives a really helpful point, and he says that when you're dealing with a critical problem, the right thing to do is give an answer. That's a helpful solution. So, the call drops. One of us needs to say, let's pick up the phone, or we just need someone to say, let's do this. When we have a tame problem, the right way to respond and find a solution is to bring out a process. So that hiring process that I mentioned before. But here's the thing, he says, with wicked problems, the last thing you want to do is give a quick answer. And there's not going to be a process because it's a novel, complex, uncertain kind of thing. And so the right thing to do is to start with questions. And so often what we see, particularly leaders do, when there's a complex, wicked problem, where they get into trouble, probably because they're stressed, they lead off with an answer. And they're saying, I'm the only one that can fix this, or we know what we're going to do. And, fair enough, we can sort of understand why they would feel they should do that, because people are looking to them for answers. We want them to have answers. They feel they ought to know because they're the leader. But it's not that kind of thing that we're dealing with. And so I find it really helpful as we understand problems, not just to be able to try to be objective about the problem, like a Stoic would want us to, but to also say, what kind of problem are we dealing with? Is it critical? Is it tame? Is it wicked? Because that gets us quite a ways down the journey already of saying, so what kind of solution should we be looking for? What even mode of solution? Should we be trying to come up with an answer, write a process, or ask some questions? And usually questions are a pretty good place to start.
And have I categorized this problem correctly? Am I responding to it in the right way for that particular scenario as well?
Yeah.
Because I can imagine you put a process on top of a wicked problem, it probably doesn't fix it.
Exactly. But there's a really interesting point there, I think, that you raised brilliantly. So probably the way that I've articulated it is too neat. Problems aren't only critical or wicked or tame. Quite often we'll have something that appears really wicked and maybe is, and we start asking questions, and then we go, oh, actually, we could sort of parse off this portion of it, and we can arrange this, and we understand it better now, and it suddenly becomes more like a tame and critical kind of problem because there's still some time sensitivity to it, but now we can start developing some processes. So there's sort of a life cycle of a problem as well, and the edges are blurry as it's moving through that cycle. So you might find that you're dealing with some organizational challenge that has elements of all three of these types of problems. But what I often find working with clients is just going through that process of having that discussion around what kind of problem are we dealing with? If it's this type, what's going on? Makes us sort of interrogate things far enough that we're usually pretty far down the line by the time you finish that process. And the professionals that I'm working with will go, oh yeah, of course. Actually, now that we see it that way, we have an idea of where to go. So just sort of doing that, that mental acrobatics of it, I think helps us see things a bit more flexibly.
So if we delve in a little bit deeper in terms of the tools that you use to understand the problem, and we've already started describing some, but could you please elaborate on some of the tools you use?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing to say is that there's probably two or three things to share. And I think the first thing is there's no magic bullets, but they're all useful in the same way that I was just articulating, I think, around the problems. They all help us to spot information that's going to be salient and helpful. And actually, I think at the end of the day, that's all any of us has to go on. We're living in the information age. The big challenge is, what do we do with that information? And problems, solutions are all just different ways of seeing things, right? So I once heard the story about Pablo Picasso, and he had done made a sculpture that that looked like a bull. I think he just called it bull, actually, out of a bicycle seat and bicycle handlebars. So the seat was sort of like the face of the bull, and the handlebars were its horns. And there's a sort of urban legend that he once had a friend come into his studio, and they're having a conversation about his creative process and how he put that together. And he said, I was just in the junkyard, and I saw these two items, and it suddenly came together in my mind, and I sort of understood them as in this different way. And I kind of think that's all we all do when it comes to creativity. It's finding new connections between things. But in order to get to that part, we have to do a bit of unlearning, something that the German Bauhaus school talked a lot about in their creative process. So, instead of seeing things just as parts of a bicycle, Picasso had to be in that state of mind where he could go, what else could that be? And a lot of times it is doing that sort of stoic move of just saying, gosh, rather than seeing it as a bicycle seat, which is me layering on my understanding of things, let me just look at the shape and the contour, the objective facts about it. It's this leather thing sort of shaped like this. That kind of looks like a face of a bull as well. So I think it's deconstructing things, trying to be as objective as possible. And that's kind of all we can do. But there are actual methodologies that I use to help people do that. And so it's not just sort of making a good cup of coffee and thinking big thoughts or something. So the first one has to do with listening and how we listen. And I'm sure you're familiar with active listening, that idea of listening out for sort of reading between the lines. So if we're having this conversation, if I'm practicing active listening, I might not just listen to the words you're saying, but I would be looking out for the sort of emotionally implicit meaning that you're articulating. And then if I'm practicing active listening as therapists and psychologists would want me to, then I would respond back to you and say, Sophie, what I'm hearing you say is da, 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 and I would talk about not just the details of our conversation, but I would talk about the sort of relational, emotional side of what we're saying. So what I do with people is philosophical listening, which is very similar, but the only difference is now, instead of listening out for the sort of relational or emotional content, now what I'm really listening out for is what I'll call the load-bearing beliefs. So, and this goes right back to the French philosopher Descartes. So, famously Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And where that saying comes from is in his book, when he says that, before he says that, he says, I'm going to try to spiral down and sort of question everything that I can, because I want to get to the bottom of what I can really know for sure. And he says, I'm going to start by doubting what the authorities tell me is true, because they're just the authorities. Maybe they don't really know what they're talking about. And then I'm going to doubt my senses, because sometimes, I don't know, things look small, but actually they're just far away. So I can't really totally trust my senses. So I've doubted it all the way down. And he says, the only thing that I can't doubt for sure is that I'm doubting, because that's a tautology. I have to be, if I'm doubting, I'm doubting. And so he says, and if I'm doubting, I must at least be thinking, because a doubt is a thought. And if I'm thinking, I must exist, because you can't think, you have to have some being do the thinking, some entity. And that's where he says, I think, therefore I exist. And he sort of builds it back up to have his whole theory of knowledge. But what I'm trying to do with people when we're doing philosophical listening, and what I'm trying to sort of either teach them to do, or I'm just doing with them, or we're doing with someone else, is that kind of a process where we're listening out for what's the bottom, what's the load-bearing belief that is running in the background, to mix all kinds of metaphors, of the people that we're talking to. So if someone says, I'm really feeling anxious about running all my meetings and my teams virtually right now. I'm really concerned. I'm anxious about that because I just think we're not going to. I don't know. I'm just feeling anxious. I'm not sure if we're going to get everything done that we need to, or whatever it might be. What I would be listening out, therefore, is what's behind that anxiety? What's the belief that this person, or we're all at this time perhaps, taking for granted, that's making them think that having a conversation virtually or running a team virtually is going to be less positive in experience than doing it in a co-located kind of more traditional way. And they might not articulate the actual answer to that, but oftentimes when we're listening in this sort of more philosophical way, we're going to know the right question to ask them. We might say, tell me more about why you're concerned about this, or it sounds to me like you're thinking that when you have a virtual meeting, this is going to happen rather than that. Tell me more about that. Why do you think that? So a lot of times people think that the philosophical listening we're doing is kind of like a coaching conversation. A lot of people know coaching conversations, and it is kind of like that. But what we're doing, again, that's slightly different is instead of just asking questions to draw out the wisdom that the other person has, when we're doing philosophical listening, what I'll do with people is I'm listening for the load-bearing belief so that we can then not just help them learn and grow, which is a good thing as well, which often happens, but the aim is to move a project forward. So it might be a question that they answer, but where a coach is only supposed to really sort of draw the other people out, the philosopher in this case can also make suggestions and say, what about this? Is this, what if we did this as well? So it's a bit more guided, I suppose, than coaching. So that's the first thing that I actually do. The next one is a way of taking our assumptions and sort of the connections in our brain and mapping them down onto a piece of paper. And we do this whenever maybe we're going through a time of change or uncertainty, and it's kind of, it might be scary or it might be exciting, but we want to get really clear on what we do. And I thought maybe if I showed you an example, that would be nice. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so I'm just gonna back this up for a second. Actually, sorry, apologies. 1 second, I'm not gonna share my screen just yet. Let me do this. I
actually have a question that follows on from philosophical listening, which is the piece of awareness. Because I was thinking about, you're listening, you're trying to drill down to the lowest common denominator of what they're talking about. But then you've also often got this filter of your own beliefs, perceptions, worldviews. And how does the awareness and stopping the filter fit into that?
So how do we deal with, while at one time we're trying to listen out for the assumptions running in the background of someone else's mind, how do we deal with our own? Yeah. It's a great point. And I think it's a back and forth. And we'll often have when we're doing this live with a group or with someone in a one-to-one sort of setting, there will be back and forth. But even if I'm not aware of my own subjectivity when I'm doing it, and my question is, as it were, not fully objective, it can still be helpful to the situation or to the other person. Ideally, it's tricky. Ideally, I would be able to ask a question that's objective, which is to say, is not about trying to solve a problem that I just care about, but is about the thing itself. But at the same time, we don't want to tease out all subjectivity, because a lot of our subjectivity, a lot of what we bring with us, is all of our lived experience. So you could say that part of what enabled Picasso to see the bicycle seat and handlebars as a bull's face was part of his subjectivity. He had been looking at bicycles in different ways. He had been to, he'd seen bulls in different situations in Spain, and he sort of, that was all bringing itself together to see the bicycle items in new ways. And our own experiences, our own subjectivity, all the values and everything we bring with us is part of the positive side of what we might call the sort of diversity of thought, or the hive mind, or ways that it's good to get different brains working on something. Yeah. So I guess that to answer your question, I think it's a great question. That on the one hand, when we're doing this kind of work, I think we need to be careful to stay focused on the work and not indulge our own pet projects So we might be talking about some challenge and I've got my own sort of political take on it or something. I need to be careful not to go there, but at the same time, I should be bringing all of my values and thoughts and way that I think to it, because that's part of the value of collaborating with people.
Mm.
Does that make sense? Or what do you think about that? I'm curious.
Yeah, it does make sense. And it's an interesting duality. And I think food for thought as well.
Cool. So shall I show you that next methodology, the tool? So I've got it all ready now. Apologies for the tech issue before. So this is something that was created by someone named Gabrielle Rico, and it was devised as a tool for helping creative writers address writer's block. What she said they should do is take the sort of concept that they're trying to write about, write it in the center of a page. So for this example, I just wrote love in the middle of the page as if I were writing a love story or something like that. And then she says, when you're stuck, write that word in the center, circle it, and then ask yourself, what comes to mind when I think of love? And so, hearts comes to mind. I wrote that down. Agape, the Greek word for love. Valentine's Day comes to mind. And if one of those seems more interesting to you, you run with that. So I said, okay, Valentine's Day. Well, when I think of Valentine's Day, I think of chocolate. When I think of chocolate, I think of sugar. When I think of sugar, I think of illness. When I think of illness, I think of death. Maybe that's a bit too dark, but those are some of the links in my brain. So I'm effectively mapping the neural pathways down onto the page, because the reason that I think of chocolate when I think of Valentine's Day is because those neurons have fired together from all the years of going through February and in the sort of culture that I've lived in, and so they've wired together, and so there's that association. So that's what she says authors should do. What I do is I've twisted this just a little bit and said, well, let's take a creative problem, or let's take a challenge, maybe one that we uncovered when we were doing the philosophical listening, and say, okay, there's something really interesting about something you've got coming up. So maybe my client needs to, they're struggling to come up with their strategy, and actually they could do it, but there's just a series of awkward conversations they need to have with stakeholders around that strategy. So through the philosophical listening, we worked out that actually the problem was a conversation. So what we might do is, and again, let me see if I can navigate through it. There we go. We might just do one of these maps with that thing that we uncovered in the philosophical listening and say, okay, so there's a tough conversation coming up. Well, for this person, for my client, what comes up, I would ask them to do this mapping, and they would say, okay, well, maybe there's something interesting here. Tough conversations make me feel awkward. I would say more generally, just there's a deep sort of uncomfortable, and I would say, why does it make us feel uncomfortable? I feel like there's a loss of peace and sort of togetherness when there's a tough conversation. And that's kind of interesting. And I would say, well, why is that the case? And we say, well, maybe there's ultimately a deep sense that I feel secure when I feel included with others, or when people like me. And that's a sort of deep primal, herd kind of thing that you could tell an evolutionary story about, why it would make sense that we would feel comfortable in that way. And I would just say, okay, so does any of that strike you as particularly interesting? And we might say, yeah, this sort of loss of peace thing is interesting. So again, let me just stop sharing that and come back. But I think the reason that I think that's helpful as a tool is if we've identified something that we can really understand the problem, this is another way for us to interrogate our own thinking about it, because a lot of those connections will be running in the background and we won't even notice it, particularly if we're kind of stressed about something. But by getting it down on the page, it helps us to sort of see what's going on. And that's, again, a really helpful step. So it doesn't tell you what to do to solve it just yet, but it does help you understand what's going on. And quite often people go, oh, actually, yeah, for example, in the awkward conversation one, I'm just concerned because it's going to make me uncomfortable. But if I see it just as that, I realize I still know what I should do. I know what the strategy should be. I just have to push through the sort of uncomfortable conversations, but that's fine. But through doing that process, we get to that place. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I have two questions about two whys that you wrote down, and how you tease out those further whys, particularly when you don't sometimes know yourself, and how you actually go through that process to tease out the underlying theme or reason.
Yeah, so let me just pop this back up. So you're talking about those two instances where we say why?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. So when I was doing this actual map, I think what I did was I just sat with it for a moment. I said, okay, this makes me feel awkward, and then that was linked to uncomfortable. And I hit a bit of a wall there, and I was thinking, so when I think of like discomfort, what comes to mind? Why, you know, and actually before I thought of why, loss of peace came to mind. So I wrote that down. And then the reason I came back and wrote why there was because I think that's interesting. Why does discomfort make me think of loss of peace? And so I'd almost say I jotted down why there, not as the causal process. It's not the asking why made me think of loss of peace, but rather as an additional reflective step to say, that's interesting. Loss of peace just popped into mind when I thought of discomfort. Why would that be the case? And that pushed me on to say, oh, because I think I probably have something around security in numbers. And so I think it's, but I think, to your other point, I'll just stop sharing this. To your other question, there quite often when we're doing these maps, it does just flow because all we're really doing is neural pathways, and there just are going to be pathways. But sometimes there'll be some blocks, and there might be connections that we don't really want to acknowledge, or we, it's harder for us to see. And there are a couple strands on that map that I didn't take further. Maybe that's for some of that reason. But the more self-awareness that we've cultivated, which just is a practice and takes time, and there's techniques and things we can do for that, but maybe it's a separate conversation. But the more self-aware that we are, the better we'll be able to do that, because we'll be practiced at saying, where's that coming from? Why am I thinking that? And I think it's just sitting with something to go, okay, that's making me think of discomfort. Why might that be? And if we sit with it, it might be a couple hours later or something, go off and do some other work, and then come back and we might go, oh yeah, okay, actually that's what it's about. Is that helpful, or does that feel like a non-answer? Because I think that's what happens, but I think it could be dissatisfying as an answer, because it's not really a solution.
I guess my question, and it's okay if it's just a question as well, was, I guess, how to come to a true why, or answer to that, and what does it mean if it's not a true why? These might just be questions to leave, or they might be something more.
Yeah. So when you say a true why, do you mean a true answer to why that thing came about?
Yes, I get. Yes.
Yeah. So, that's a really good point, and it kind of goes to the last tool that I was going to share with you. So maybe if I tell you a bit about that and then see what you think. But I think it's, just to foreshadow, my sense is that to understand whether or not we've hit on a legitimate or authentic, I would say authentic rather than legitimate, because all sort of perspectives can be legitimate and that they're valuable, but an authentic or accurate, correct answer. To know if we've hit on one, I think takes wisdom, which when you look up the definition of wisdom, most dictionaries will say things like, it's that wisdom is the coming together of your knowledge and experience. And a lot of times we think about wisdom just as the knowledge bit. So people have read a lot of books are wise or something, but actually it's that knowledge plus your lived experience. So you might say, yeah, I know all these theories about stuff, but through living and applying those theories have worked out that actually this is how it goes. And so I think part of my answer, as I'm just sort of thinking this out loud, is when we try to map our understanding of a challenge down on the page, if we get to a place and we go, that's kind of interesting, why is that linked there? What is that about? We might come up with an answer, and bringing wisdom to apply to that means saying, do I think that that's a true answer? Does it seem right? Does it stand up to all the evidence that might be related, external research, if it's relevant and things like that? Does it stand up when I really interrogate my motives? Or, I might be able to tell, am I writing down an answer that is actually just easy, but isn't really the right one? It just is sort of the one I'd like to be the answer. And that's, I guess, like going along with wisdom, because it's the lived experience of getting to know yourself over time and saying, no, actually, I can sort of, that smells to me, that answer, a bit like insincerity. And I can tell that it's not really the true link in my own brain, or that that's not really what we're talking about here. So I think it's again, I feel like it's a bit of a non-answer to some extent, but I think that's part of it. But maybe if I just tell you briefly this last thing, and it's the tool of asking great questions. So if we go back to understanding of wicked problems as problems which are not amenable to answers or processes, but we need to start with questions. It's really important to point out that not all questions are as effective. I don't know about you, I've been in lots of meetings or conferences and things where people have asked questions that were not really questions. They sort of, they might have, if written down, transcribed, they might have finished with a question mark, but actually the intent and the work that they were doing in the room was not really one of a question. They were sort of making a political play, or they were used to sort of shame someone, or, it wasn't really about curiosity. And so I think a big thing, and again, I think this is a technique that I use with groups, but it's primarily about getting clear on what's really going on with a wicked problem. And it's just around understanding how we are forming our questions and how we get ourselves to ask really great questions. And the things that we do is we say, let's make sure that let's draft a bunch of questions we think we have, and then let's look at them and let's say, are all of these humble? Are they, in other words, are we asking them because we want to show how smart we are to know that we can ask that smart question? Or is it sort of an authentic question? Are they bold? So they might be contentious and asking something, that might be opening a can of worms, but we think needs to be asked. So they're authentic, bold. Are they non-judgmental? So similarly, is there a power play, or are they, are we coming to it objectively? And are they vital? Do they need to be asked? Because we could ask a question that is authentic, we're really curious about it, it's bold, it takes some courage to say this, it's non-judgmental, but it just doesn't really need to be asked right now. And so that vital piece is really important also. And once we've gone through our sort of long list of questions and probably scratched some out and said, actually, yeah, these are I think important for us to be thinking about in this meeting, or whatever it might be, then what we'll often do is say, okay, we're going to zoom in and zoom out. And so now let's look at our questions and reframe them so that we have some questions that are going to interrogate the piece of work we're dealing with in a way which is zooming in and saying, what do we mean by, have we defined all of our terms? So let's get down into the detail and ask some questions about terms, application, what do we mean by X, whatever it might be. But then let's also zoom out and ask the sort of big questions around how does the thing we're working with map onto the bigger work of our team, or the bigger story in the industry right now, and look for some of those other connections. What we're trying to do here is try to sort of, on the one hand, map our landscape and test the soil. And we're trying to come up with questions that help us do that. And to be honest, if we're working on a project, we're working on a matter, a case, whatever it might be, and we've done that philosophical listening, we're sort of interrogated each other a bit and ourselves. We've checked out our own thought processes, and then we've formed some questions that are doing that real work for us. Through that process, we're going to then come to some answers and some solutions that I think are not only creative, but are going to be doing real work for us. They're going to be creative because they're going to make new connections we didn't see before, kind of like the Picasso thing, but they're going to do real work also because, we're not doing this in a vacuum. We're doing this with people that are experts in their industry that, so when I'm doing this with a team of lawyers, they are bringing a lot of knowledge about their specific cases in their worlds, right? When I'm doing it with people in media, whatever, same thing. And so even though I'm the one sort of doing it in the vacuum without their sort of, I don't know, all their expert information, because we're doing this in that context of their worlds, that it's populated with all their legal knowledge and everything, we pretty quickly get to a place where we now have some solutions that are actually going to do work in the sort of real world context. So that's sort of how I understand the problems, and it's the kind of things that we do to find some solutions to them as well.
Brilliant. And as you go through those techniques and tools, what role do people play in that?
Yeah, so hugely. I mean, they're sort of the whole thing, because I think philosophy is a tool, but it doesn't really do much on its own. So philosophy needs something to push against. You need to, all throughout what I've been talking about, you need a set of assumptions to interrogate. You need beliefs to work on. You need, all these different things. And so we have to start with ourselves, with people, with the ideas that we hold. But also there's another point around diversity of thought and getting people in the room and collaborating, taking a collaborative approach and sharing all those different ideas. And so it's not something that I think we can do sort of, as I've already said, in a vacuum or on a separate page. It's set apart. It has to be, it's a very human process. And the only other thing to say about that, I think, is that means it requires a fair bit of trust. Because again, people aren't going to feel safe enough to ask their questions, come up with the new solutions and things like that if they don't feel safe. So oftentimes I'll work with groups. The first thing we'll do is talk about psychological safety and work on building trust, so that climate is there, and then we can go through these things and we feel, I suppose, more safe and free to do all the process I was just talking about. So yeah, people are key.
Could I get you just to elaborate on this concept of trust? Because in uncertainty, we need to trust each other. We need to trust that we're going to do the work, trust that we have each other's back. What does that look like when it's done successfully? And what is it made up of?
Yeah, great question. So maybe one thing that's helpful to say is that sometimes we talk about trust and we think about it just as the confidence that I can say, count on you to do something, right? So we talk about trusting, a taxi driver to take us to the right destination, or we trust, surgeons and doctors to care well for us. And a lot of that is just about their competence in the professional context. And that's true. That's a big part of it. But actually, when we're talking about creative problem solving, the most salient part of it isn't our professional expertise and our competence in that sense. It's the motives, the state of our sort of goodwill towards each other and our character, that isn't as salient when you're talking about having a surgery or having a taxi driver take you someplace. Because it doesn't really matter to me whether or not the taxi driver likes me. I just want to know that they're going to do their job correctly. And I might even check up while they're driving by opening a map app on my phone and checking that they're taking me where I think they're taking me, right? So you can follow up. I'm relying on them. I have to rely on them to drive me, but I can check up on them, and that works for reliance. As soon as I start checking up on someone, it's not accurate anymore to say that I'm trusting them. As soon as I start checking up, then it shows that actually I'm not really comfortable with being that vulnerable to them. And those, talking about vulnerability and accepting that vulnerability, thinking, okay, I have a sense that you have a goodwill towards me, I have goodwill towards you, we feel comfortable with each other. That's the stuff that creates the safe space for us to, deal with challenges, have lots of uncertainty, because we're not gonna get through, let's say, this coronavirus crisis just because we've got lots of competence in the system. We certainly need that, and that's a huge amount. We need medical competence. We need, governments to be competent. We need all kinds of expertise. But you could have the most competent, expert leaders, but we also want to know that they're going to use their competence for our best interest, right? You could have the best lawyer, the best surgeon, and yet I want to know, are they going to, are they motivated to use all their expertise for my sake right now, And so I think the really salient part of trust in this crisis, and when we're talking about creative problem solving and wicked problems, yes, we need to have the competence, but what we're talking about more is what are sort of our attitudes towards each other. And so some of the things we need to talk about there is, how do we know that? How do we build that? And a lot of times it is just connection. So, empathizing with each other, sharing, well, what are your expectations for the way we're working now in this new normal? What are my expectations? And having that conversation to say, oh, that's interesting. I had no idea about that. Yeah, I can do that as long, now that I know it, but, whatever it might be. So you might say, now that we're working completely virtually, would it be okay if we handle these kinds of matters in email, these kinds of matters on, Slack or whatever? And if we have this kind of an issue, we just agree to pick up the phone and handle it. And it might feel like an awkward conversation for some of us to have at the start, but having that conversation is really important. It's a detailed kind of conversation, but it's really important for trust, because going through that, then we can go, okay, we have a sense of where we're going. We have a sense that we're okay with our preferences and how we work. And that helps me feel that we're on the same page. We're not just competent, we're also sort of going in the same direction together. So I don't know if that really speaks to your question or is helpful, but that's kind of some of my thinking around it.
And closely linked is, how do you encourage cultural adoption to change?
Sure. Yeah. And I think, again, this goes right back to the question about people. So sometimes we think, let's get the right strategy in place. So let's get the right change, let's come up with the right innovation. And then now, how do we get people to adopt it? But actually, I think we're going to be a lot more successful. What we try to do with the work we're doing with clients is completely flip that to say, let's take a collaborative approach right off the bat. So, I'll work with clients to say, let me tell you what I would normally do in this situation, or what, say we're doing a training workshop, rather than just being an off-the-shelf kind of product. I'll say, look, here's what we do. Here are the sort of tools from philosophy and things like that. But let me go through this with you, not with everyone in the whole company, but with the sort of lead person that's bringing me in, and say, I want to go through this with you so that you can help me to see where there might be ways that we can rephrase questions, where we can change things so that it lands really well with your people and does as much work for you as possible, because that's going to help us bring people on board right from the start, so that along the way we just don't have that same challenge. We can create the innovation and cultivate the culture as we go. There's much better buy-in because people are actually bought in, they're actually involved right from the start. So I think my thinking there is just, the sooner we can get people involved, the better.
Absolutely. And the last question, sadly, is a word, a phrase, or an image of what creativity means to you.
Cool. Yeah. So I thought a bit about this, and I think that for me, a lot of what creativity, and I suppose this has probably come out in the conversation already, using that Picasso example, where what we see Picasso doing is thinking about his own thinking, looking for new connections, unlearning, saying, is this just a bicycle or is it other stuff? Let me think about it. To the Stoic point as well, going back to the start of the call, that's all about how we think about things, how we try to tease out the objective thing from subjective, all the different methods and things we talked about. It's all about how we understand things. And so the image that I've got is this thinking better so that we can do better, which is a phrase that we use a lot around philosophy at work. But it's this idea that doing better, doing our best, isn't just about execution. It all starts with how we think about things. And so for me, creativity starts with how we think and how we understand things. And it's the process of creativity is a thoughtful process as well.
Thank you so much, Brennan, for diving into your way of working and how you bring philosophy to life and engage with people and dive into critical thinking and how we think and our perceptions and the theory of knowledge to better how we work, better how we think, and better how we live, really. So thank you.
My pleasure, Sophie. It's been such a pleasure, and thank you very much again for inviting me to get to do this with you. It was great.
Thank you.